Welcome. I'm Kathleen Propp, Winnebago County League of Women Voters co-president. This meeting is sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Winnebago County, the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin Education Network, and funding is provided by the Joyce Foundation. It will be taped for replay on Oshkosh Community Media Services City Cable 2, public access television. For replay times, go to their website at www.oshkoshcommunitymedia.org. For information about the League of Women Voters, go to www.lwvwinnebago.org or the state website at www.lwvwi.org. Our topic tonight is the power of money. What matters most in elections, voters or money? Our guest speaker is Mike McCabe, Executive Director of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. Wisconsin Democracy Campaign is a nonpartisan watchdog group working for clean, open, and honest government and reforms that make people matter more than money in politics. WDC specializes in tracking the money in state politics. Mike grew up on a dairy farm in Clark County, graduated from UW-Madison in 1982 with degrees in journalism and political science. He formerly worked as a newspaper reporter and a legislative aide. He served in the Peace Corps in the West African country of Mali. Mike McCabe joined the Democracy Campaign's staff in 1999, became director in 2000. Please welcome Mike McCabe.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you all for coming and taking a time away from a beautiful evening and giving me a chance to share some thoughts with you. I appreciate your willingness to be a part of this discussion. I want to thank the League of Women Voters for sponsoring forums like this around the state and for all the work that they do. The Democracy Campaign works very closely with the State League of Women Voters on policy initiatives of mutual interest. And as a matter of fact, one of our major funders happens to be the Joyce Foundation, which is paying for this meeting here tonight. And so we not only share a lot of common goals and aspirations, we share common funders to a great extent as well. The Democracy Campaign is a nonpartisan watchdog group. It's the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, not the Democratic Campaign or Republican Campaign. I'm not here to tell you which side is right or wrong or which party to vote for. Our job is really to try to be a force for clean and open and honest government in Wisconsin, and to try to hold power accountable and to help citizens see what's going on in their capital. We specialize in tracking the money in state politics, and we specialize in doing research that connects the dots between all that money that flows into state campaigns and the policy outcomes, the policy decisions that elected officials make in the state capitol. We shine light in those dark corners in the building, and we try to show people what we see when we shine that light. That's what the Democracy Campaign is all about. And I have to tell you that I think we are gathered here at a time when our democracy is perhaps at greater risk and under greater threat than at any time in living memory. I think you have to go back before any of us in this room was on this planet to find a time where comparable conditions existed and where comparable challenges and threats to our democracy existed. I don't think any of us has seen anything quite like what we face today. And I think the central challenge that we face, the central problem that is behind all of the other problems and behind all of the other frustrations that we have about our government's inability to come to terms and come to grips with the problems that we face, really can be boiled down to this. I really think that our elected officials are more afraid of their donors than they are of the voters. And that is our central problem. And pretty much everything else spins off of that. Let's face it, our government works best when politicians serve in fear. But it works best when they serve in fear of the voters and not just their donors. And that is something that we are losing. We're losing the accountability that comes with a healthy fear of the electorate, because they are so concerned, so fearful of their donors cutting them off that they are forever catering to them, forever worrying about how they can keep those donors happy so that the money keeps flowing, so that they can keep running the television ads, so that they can keep putting the junk mail in your mailbox, so that they can keep polluting your voicemail and your answering machine with robocalls. They have to have money to do that, and that is the central crisis that we face. And I don't have to tell any of you what has transpired in Wisconsin in recent weeks and months. We're here at an historic moment. It's not every year that 100,000 people gather at the Capitol. It is not every year that you have 9 recall elections. As a matter of fact, there were 2 legislators recalled before this summer. There were 2 legislators recalled in the history of our state, dating back to the beginning of statehood in 1848. And that number was doubled in a single summer. And we had 9 recall elections. That was absolutely unprecedented, to be sure. So we're dealing with things that we've never seen before. Now, we just finished tallying the spending in those 9 Senate recall elections. And by our best estimate, spending was about $44 million. Now let me put that in perspective for you. The previous record for spending in legislative races in Wisconsin was set just a few years ago in 2008. In 2008, $20.2 million was spent on state legislative elections in Wisconsin. But that was in 115 elections. 99 assembly races and 16 state senate races. $20.2 million total was spent. This summer alone, in just 9 races, $44 million got spent. Now, let me put those numbers in perspective one other way. Special interest groups, out of the $44 million, special interest groups on their own spent about $34.5 million. They sponsored their own advertising. They mounted their own campaigns. That's not counting the money that they gave to candidates to fuel their efforts. But on their own, sponsoring their own advertising, mounting their own campaigns, they burned through about $34.5 million. That's more than interest groups spent in the 1998, 2002, 2006, and 2010 races for governor combined. In those statewide elections where they were trying to influence every part of the state, in 98, 2002, 2006, and 2010, they didn't spend as much as they did just to try to influence elections in 9 of the 33 Senate districts in Wisconsin. We saw spending so off the charts, that so out of the realm of anything that we've experienced, that again, we're in unprecedented times. We're in uncharted waters. We've never seen anything like this, and that's been a common theme throughout 2011 so far in Wisconsin. We're living in very unusual times. You know, I don't need to talk a lot about how strange our politics have become in Wisconsin or nationally. You know, you look at approval ratings for Congress, it's down to 12% of the American people who approve of the job performance of Congress. People are frustrated across the country, not just here in Wisconsin. 12%. And you know, when I saw that number, my first thought is, what's wrong with the 12% that still approves? You know, what are they thinking? And, you know, that's a sign of our times, that we have very dysfunctional politics. But I think what's so important to look at is what's underneath that dysfunction, what's behind it. Yeah, it's not every year that you see a Supreme Court's justice's throat find its way into another's hands. But there's something behind that too. What's happened to our Supreme Court, I think, has everything to do with the fact that we stopped having Supreme Court elections in 2007 and we started having Supreme Court auctions. Once we started seeing, $5.8 million spent on a Supreme Court election in 2007, which was more than 4 times more than had ever been spent on a Supreme Court election before, that's when things started to go haywire. And in 2008, it was $6 million. Earlier this year, it was $5.4 million. And so we've stopped having Supreme Court elections and we've started having auctions for the state's highest court. And the chase for money, the need to line up these special interest groups, the need to keep those special interest groups happy, has sown the seeds of what is now playing out in our Supreme Court. The rancor, the division, the partisanship, the dysfunction that we see that even has escalated to physical altercations. I think that has its roots in something that started happening a few years ago. And I think the same thing is true for our legislature and for the office of governor and for our Congress. And that is what we have to come to grips with as a society. And I don't think we're close to doing that yet. But when you look at how public policy is being made in Wisconsin, on issue after issue after issue, what I see are elected officials who are more afraid of their donors than they are of the voters. And you look at the most recent state budget, and it was a great illustration. First of all, I saw in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel today, or maybe it was yesterday, they did one of their PolitiFact pieces that they truth test certain claims that are made, and they truth tested the claim that Governor Walker has made that Wisconsin is broke and that we have a $3 billion in debt. And they rated it pants on fire. So untrue that they rated it pants on fire. And yet, so many decisions in this past state budget that was just enacted earlier this year was based on the claim that Wisconsin is broke. School funding was cut by close to $1 billion, over $800 million in school cuts, because the state is broke. Healthcare assistance for the poor and the elderly and the disabled, senior care, Badger care, family care, all cut severely because the state is broke. Over and over and over again, we heard that refrain that the state is broke. But then you look more carefully and they somehow found the money for several $100 million in new corporate tax breaks. And they somehow found the money for close to a 15% increase in road construction funding. So couldn't afford schools, and you couldn't afford to help disabled people or elderly people or poor people with health care, but there was enough money to throw hundreds of millions of dollars of new money at road construction. Then I'm reading in the newspaper, and keep in mind that I grew up on a dairy farm in Clark County on a dirt road. And I always had the impression that a sign of progress was when roads got paved. Well, now I'm reading in the newspaper a week or so ago that there are rural towns in Wisconsin that are tearing up their pavement and putting down gravel because they can't afford to keep up the pavement. So we're going back to dirt roads in Wisconsin. And that would make sense. That might make sense if you had a 15% cut in road money in the budget. Then you'd think, well, hard times. The money's short. You don't have the money to take care of the roads. But the state budget has close to a 15% increase for roads. Yet the money's not being steered to local road crews. It's being taken and targeted to private construction firms. They get the money and the local road crews don't. So here in Wisconsin, we're cutting schools and we're cutting health care for needy people, and we're tearing up pavement in some rural communities and putting down gravel again, but we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars that we're funneling to private road contractors, and we've got hundreds of millions of dollars in new corporate tax breaks. And none of that makes a bit of sense unless you follow the money. And when you follow the money, then the answers become obvious. When Scott Walker was a member of the Assembly, and he served in the Assembly for about 10 years, he got next to no financial support from the road builders. Almost nothing. A couple of $1,000 over the course of 10 years. And then he ran for governor. You may not recall this, but he ran for governor very briefly in 2006. Took a shot at it, dropped out because it didn't appear that he was going to get the Republican nomination. During his eventually aborted run for governor in 2006, he got next to no support from the road builders. A couple of $1,000 for that campaign. Then he runs in 2010 and he becomes the single biggest recipient of road builder contributions in our state. Hundreds of thousands of dollars flow into the Walker campaign. More money went to Walker than all the members of our legislature combined. And the road builders have never been bashful about sending money the way of state legislators, regardless of party. They don't care what party label you got. They figure Democrats as well as Republicans can pour concrete. He becomes the #1 recipient of road builder money. And then, of course, right after he gets elected, he throws away $800 million in federal rail funds. Says, we don't want the money. Well, it didn't exactly say we don't want the money, because the road builders said that money should be used for what they called crumbling roads instead. And Walker said, whatever you want. And he petitioned the federal government to use those rail funds for roads instead. And the federal government said, these are rail funds. If you don't want them, there are lots of states standing in line waiting for the rail money, and they gave it away to other states. Illinois got some, New Jersey got some, California got some. The federal road funds that would have created jobs here, that would have stimulated economic development along an entire corridor stretching halfway across our state, went to other states. Money that you've all paid to Washington in federal taxes, some of that money, $800 million of it, was due to come back to us, and we threw it away because a big interest group said that the money should be used for roads instead. And we ended up with holding the bag. We ended up with nothing. And, you know, think about it. The road builders want to keep people in cars. They don't want people taking trains. They want to keep people in cars. They want to keep people dependent on those roads. They don't want anything to compete with that. And so in criminal rackets, that used to be called protection money. Now they're called campaign contributions. But what is that but protection money? What is it that the road builders really did except pay protection money? They paid to have public officials protect them from competition, protect them from public policies that would make their lives a little bit more difficult, perhaps. Then we've seen a whole bunch of wind energy projects deep-sixed in recent weeks and months. Close to a dozen of them would be new jobs, new economic development, and yet they've been blocked, consistently blocked. Policies are being put in place that are hostile to the development of wind energy. Now, I don't care what party you belong to. I don't care where you fall on the political spectrum. You ask anybody in this state, you ask any American, is it a good idea to try to become less dependent on foreign oil? Is it a good idea to promote energy independence? Is it a good idea to develop alternatives to fossil fuel? And you will get a resounding yes. And yet Wisconsin is blocking that very development. Now why? Well, oil and gas interests, the Koch brothers alone Coke Industries alone put more than $1 million into the election of a governor. They don't want people developing alternatives to oil. They want to keep us addicted to fossil fuel. They paid what I would consider pretty plainly protection money. And, you know, and the two other major interests that are the groups that are lobbying intensely against wind energy development and biofuels happen to be the realtors and the construction industry. Also, over $1 million into the election of a governor, lots more into the election of legislators. And so what we're seeing is public policy distorted. We're seeing public policy that the public would clearly want pushed aside and deep-sixed, kneecapped. And why? It's because certain industries, certain interests have paid protection money to be safeguarded against any of that kind of development. That's what's happening on issue after issue after issue, and that is the scandal of our time. That is the single biggest challenge we face. I don't care whether your top issue, whether the thing that makes your heart burn, what inflames you is education or the environment or health care or climate change. It doesn't matter. We're not going to solve any of those problems. We're not going to solve the tax problem. We're not going to solve the budget problem until we deal with the problem that is behind all of those problems, and that's the problem of money in politics. That is the central challenge of our time. Now, I have a knack for dragging people down into a pit of despair when I talk. And I promise you that I probably will drag you down a little deeper still, but I will leave you with a ray of hope. And one of the ways that we can hold on to hope at a very challenging moment for hope is to remember that we are here today during the 100th anniversary of the most amazing legislative session in the history of our state. Quite possibly the most amazing legislative session in American history. The 1911 session of the Wisconsin legislature was easily one of the most productive legislatures in history. Also a legislature that established policies that ended up creating the reputation of the state that you and I inherited. We think of Wisconsin as a progressive state. We think of Wisconsin as a policy pioneer. All of what we think about Wisconsin, or at least what we thought about Wisconsin before more recent times, was really established by the 1911 legislature. That legislature created workers' compensation. The first system of workers' compensation anywhere in America was created by the 1911 legislature. They enacted sweeping railroad regulation, insurance industry reform. They created a state life insurance plan. Vocational and technical education was established by the 1911 legislature. Vocational and technical schools were started then. They created the nation's first progressive income tax. Nowhere in America had you seen income taxation. A progressive income tax was pioneered here in Wisconsin. And on it went. That's a partial listing of their successes. All of that happened in one session. But I think what's really important to remember about the 1911 session is that it is no accident that that happened in 1911. Because what happened in 1911 was made possible by what happened years earlier. In 1897, the Wisconsin legislature passed anti-corruption legislation and pro-democracy legislation that banned bribery, banned illegal voting and election fraud. Now, think about bribery. This was 1897. You all know when Wisconsin became a state, 1848. That means that for the first half century of statehood, it was perfectly legal to bribe a public official in Wisconsin. And in fact, it was a common practice. None of us is old enough to remember this. But if you've heard me speak before, you probably have heard me tell this story. For those of you who haven't heard it, I tell it often. But a great example of Wisconsin's history that none of us remembers because none of us was alive at the time was the reason that, well, anybody know what Wisconsin Dells was called before it was called Wisconsin Dells? And don't feel bad, because this is an obscure damn trivia question. Nobody should know this. But it used to be known as Kilbourne, or Kilbourne City, named for Byron Kilbourne. If you drive in downtown Milwaukee, you end up on Kilbourne Avenue eventually. And for years, Wisconsin Dells was known as Kilbourne City, named for Byron Kilbourne, who built a railroad from Milwaukee to La Crosse, and he crossed the Wisconsin River at what is now Wisconsin Dells, and they named the city for him. He built that railroad on bribes. He built that railroad on political graft. See, Byron Kilbourne needed land from Milwaukee to La Crosse. He needed land along a corridor stretching all the way across the state, but he didn't want to pay the property owners for their land. He wanted the state to seize the land using its power of eminent domain and give it to him for free in a land grant. So he went to the Capitol with bags of cash, and he made over $350,000 worth of bribes to members of our state assembly to get them to pass his land grant bill. This is at a time when the average working person in Wisconsin was making less than $1 a day, and a skilled craftsman was making $2 a day. Astonishing sums of money that Kilbourne was throwing around. And they passed his bill in the assembly, and it went to the Senate, and he made $175,000 in additional bribes to state senators, and they passed his land grant bill. According to the historical record, only one legislator who was offered the money turned it down, a fellow named Amasa Cobb, a state senator, who came to be known as Honest Amasa Cobb. Wonder why? Everybody else took the money and they voted for his land grant. It landed on the governor's desk, and Kilbourne went to the governor, who at the time was Coles Bashford, and offered Bashford $50,000 to sign his bill into law. Bashford took the money and he signed the bill. Kilbourne had his free land. He built his railroad from Milwaukee to La Crosse, made a fortune without ever compensating any of the landowners for the money that he got from them or stole from them. And the rest is history. He's got a big old thoroughfare in Milwaukee named for him. Wisconsin Dells was named for him for years. And I tell that story in part to remind us that we have faced times like these. We've faced challenges like these before. I also tell this story because of the reaction that it provoked, because the story's not done yet. You see, those legislators who took those bribes came to be known as the 40 Thieves. And in the next election, every single one of the 40 Thieves was removed from office. Every one of them. Not a one survived the next election. And Coles Bashford lost his bid for re-election by 118 votes to Alexander Randall, for whom Camp Randall Stadium is named, where the Badgers play their football. And that little episode was part of what eventually led the 1897 legislature to ban the practice of bribing public officials. And then in 1905, the legislature banned corporate campaign contributions and corporate election spending. Corporate election spending is something that the United States Supreme Court just legalized again last year in a case called Citizens United versus FEC. And so we've come full circle. We're right back to where we were 100 and some years ago. We face very similar challenges. I think in a very real sense. Bribery was legal for the first 50 years of statehood. Then it was banned. Its banning and the banning of things like corporate contributions and corporate election spending and all the other reforms that were ushered in, they created the foundation upon which the 1911 session of the legislature was built. Without those reforms, they never would have been able to pass workers' compensation and railroad reform and create vocational and technical schools by creating a progressive income tax. None of that would have been possible if the actions had not been taken first by 1897 legislators and those who served in 1905. And that's something that we have to remember. If you think that we're going to get fair tax policy and enlightened energy policy and healthcare policy that serves the common good and the public interest until we solve the money in politics problem, that's not going to happen because bribery has been made legal again. Now the bribes are called campaign contributions, or one of my favorites, they call them independent expenditures, which is a buying of elections, the buying of politicians, and then the owning of our government. And they've gussied up the names, but the game is exactly the same. They pour huge amounts of wealth into the buying of politicians and the owning of our government, and then they get policies that we think make absolutely no sense. Does it make sense to steer us away from energy independence? Does it make sense to try to keep us dependent on fossil fuel? Well, of course not. But that's exactly what our policies are doing because those oil and gas interests have paid for those policies to be put in place. Does it make sense for local road crews to be tearing up pavement when you see what's happening to Highway 41? But that's exactly what's happening in Wisconsin because the companies that are doing all that work on Highway 41 paid to make sure the money was steered in their direction and not toward those local road crews that are now putting down gravel. That's the scandal of our time. And that is what we have to come to terms with. And you know, one of the things I think we have to do is first and foremost, we have to accept that bribery has effectively been made legal again. And it's the job of our time to recriminalize political bribery. That is something that fundamentally has to happen. Just as it was important a century ago, it is essential now to criminalize bribery. And that act would set the stage for another legislature, very much like that 1911 legislature, I guarantee you. There are things we can do. If people tell you, well, you know, there's nothing that can be done because the United States Supreme Court and Citizens United said that money is speech and corporations are people and they can spend as much as they want and there's nothing we can do about it, there are things we can do about it. One thing that we can and must do is insist on disclosure. Citizens United not only opened new channels for more money to flow, but Citizens United's perhaps biggest effect has been to enable groups to conceal that money from public view. A few short elections ago, we could see the origins of over 90% of the money that interest groups spent. In the 2010 elections, less than half of it came from identified donors. That was the impact of Citizens United, a dramatic drop-off in the ability to see who's really behind that advertising. We can and we must insist on disclosure laws at the state and federal level that allow the public to see who is doing the buying. And knowing who's doing the buying will have an effect on those who are pouring all this money in because they will be held accountable in a way that they're not now. People will know that they've put that money in. People can boycott them if they want. People can take actions that hold those donors accountable. We can't do that unless we know about it. Disclosure is entirely constitutional. 8 of the 9 justices, even in the Citizens United case, only Clarence Thomas voted against disclosure. 8 of the 9 justices said you can have disclosure. 5 justices said you can't limit corporate or interest group spending in any way, but 8 of the 9 justices said, but you can have disclosure. And we have to challenge Congress and challenge our state legislature to give us that in response to Citizens United. That we can do. Second thing we can do is we can do public financing of elections. We can have candidates who are not hopelessly beholden to those special interests by being addicted to the money that those special interests supply them. And keep in mind, I told you earlier about $44 million raised and spent in these recall elections. We had 3 candidates break the old record for most spent by a legislative candidate. So we saw record amounts of money raised and spent by these candidates. And yet the candidates were outspent 4-to-1 by the interest groups, even though they were raising and spending record sums of money. Well, we can at least wean them from their addiction, their dependence on special interest money. We can force the interest groups to disclose so it's out in the light of day who they really are and where the money is coming from to do this. And then there's a third thing we can and we must do. And that is, if we are going to have unlimited corporate and interest group spending, then we have to have shareholder rights and corporate accountability. And the same for other interest groups. And keep in mind, when I talk about corporate election spending, I know what's running through your head. You're thinking about businesses. But corporations are any incorporated entity. They can be political front groups, nonprofit organizations that are supposed to be doing charitable work and are doing nothing but raising unlimited sums of money to buy elections. Now, groups formed under Section 501C of the Internal Revenue Code are charitable organizations. And by law, more than half of their work cannot be political. They are duty-bound by law to keep politics as a minority of their work. And yet we have these phony front groups springing up during an election. We've never seen them before. They've never done any work in Wisconsin, yet they pour millions of dollars into an election campaign and then they vanish into thin air. They are gaming the tax code. The Internal Revenue Service can and should insist that they obey the law and prove, in order to have tax-exempt status, they should prove that their work is primarily non-political. That can happen and should happen. But we should have legislation at the state and federal level that says that if you're going to spend this money, you have to get your shareholders or your members' permission. It's their money. They supplied you with all this money. So if you're going to spend it, you should have to go get their permission. And we could do that, and it would be entirely constitutional. And it would have a huge impact on their capacity to do what they're doing now in buying elections, pouring $44 million into recall elections. And by the way, on that $44 million, the 2 biggest spenders were not candidates. The 2 biggest spenders were 2 interest groups that have names that make them seem pretty homegrown. One was a group called We Are Wisconsin, and the other was called Wisconsin Club for Growth. We Are Wisconsin spent $10.7 million. They reported spending $10.7 million. $10.1 million came from 3 national unions based in Washington, D.C. So they got a little bit of money from some state unions. They got a little bit of money from some citizens around the state. But almost all of their money came from 3 national unions based in Washington, D.C. Almost all their money came from outside our borders. Then Wisconsin Club for Growth. They did not disclose either their spending or their source of income. But we do know, because television stations were willing to share ad invoices with us, we do know that they outspent We Are Wisconsin on television advertising by more than 18%. So they spent a boatload of money. And we were able to track down 2 donors by scouring IRS records. Now they raised, $10 million or somewhere in that vicinity. We could only find 2 donors. $250,000 from a Texas oil man by the name of Trevor Reese Jones, and $150,000 from a global securities and asset management firm called Citadel, which has offices in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Boston, Hong Kong, and London. No operations in Wisconsin. So here are these groups, Wisconsin Club for Growth and We Are Wisconsin, they sound homegrown, but they are anything but. And that's what elections have come to in the state of Wisconsin. And we can do something about that. We can force it out into the open. We can create accountability and enforce shareholder and member rights so that actual people have to give permission to have their money spent in this way. We can have public financing, but I do think we have to rethink public financing. And that's one of the things I want to finish up with, is challenge you to think in a completely different way about the idea of publicly financed elections. I know the League has supported the idea of public financing for many years, but the idea of public financing started with the premise that it was the only constitutional way to get spending limits on campaigns. It was the only way that the courts would allow spending limits to be enforced, is if candidates voluntarily agreed to limit their spending in exchange for public financing grants. So every public financing law, including the one that was put in place in Wisconsin in the late 1970s, including the Impartial Justice Act, which was in effect for a year here in Wisconsin for state Supreme Court elections, all of the bills that have been introduced, the Ellis-Erpenbach bill and all the campaign finance reform legislation, have all been based on the idea, they've all been premised on spending limits. They've all been based on the idea that you get public financing only if you limit your spending. But with the Supreme Court now ruling that there can be no limit placed on interest group spending and corporate election spending, that old idea of public financing is obsolete. Because if a candidate is stupid enough to accept public financing in exchange for limiting their spending, what they've done is they've unilaterally disarmed. They've decided to take a place on the sidelines and become a bystander in their own election. And no one in a competitive election will do that. So we have to have a totally new way of thinking about public financing. We've put forward a proposal. I brought along a petition if you care to share your support of it. Also, some action steps that can be taken. We put forward a proposal that we're calling Ending Wealthfare. We call it Ending Wealthfare because we currently have an election financing system with $44 million recall elections, where all of the contributions to candidates are made by less than 1% of the population of our state. Let me repeat that. All of the campaign contributions to state politicians come from less than 1% of the population. Count up all the donations in our database. We have a searchable computer database that is available free of charge on our website. If you would count up every single donor there, the total number of donors to all these candidates for office amount to less than 1% of our population. And what we see is 1% of the population bankrolling their campaigns and then being very richly rewarded for their political support. We've done a whole series of reports that show that for every dollar big donors put into elections, they get $100 back. We looked at $50 million worth of campaign money. We looked at the source of that money. And then we looked at what those interests lobbied for and got from public officials. $50 million went in, $5 billion came back to them. That's a return on investment you can't get on Wall Street in the best bull market. But what they essentially are doing is they're paying for elections, and then they are getting welfare in return. They're getting welfare payments in the form of tax breaks and pork barrel spending and no-bid contracts for government work and all manner of favors and benefits that come back to them at our expense. And that $5 billion worth of welfare amounts to over $1,300 for each and every taxpayer in the state of Wisconsin every year. So if anybody ever tells you that they don't think there should be public financing of election campaigns, you got to tell them the public will always pay for elections one way or another. We could pay for them directly, or we can do it the way we do now, where less than 1% of the population pays for the campaigning, and then we pay to reward those donors for their political support. And that's exactly the game that's being played now. Ending welfare would aim at weaning politicians from that reliance on that less than 1% that currently donate to them now, and would try to supercharge, create a small donor revolution in two ways. By giving candidates an incentive to go and chase small donations, by giving public matches for small donations to make those small donations seem like big donations, and then also give a $50 tax credit to anybody who makes a small donation, a $50 donation. And so reward people for getting involved in this way, and reward politicians for chasing that kind of support, and you could change the landscape dramatically. A professor out at the State University of New York at Albany has a computer model that he throws numbers into, and he spits out the effects of various campaign finance policy. And he ran our proposal through his system. And right now in Wisconsin, about 34%, more than a third of all the money comes from people who give $1,000 or more. Something like 16% of the money comes from people who give $100 or less. And keep in mind, all the money comes from a population that's less than 1% of the population of Wisconsin. He ran our system into this computer model of his, and what he found is that the percentage of donations from people who give $100 or less would go from 16% to over 90%. And the percentage coming from people who give $1,000 or more would go from 34% down to 6%. Now that would be game changing. That would be landscape altering if you could have those policies. We combine lower contribution limits with these incentives for small donor giving, plus we build in disclosure, plus we build in corporate accountability and shareholder rights. You have to get permission from your members or your shareholders to do this kind of spending. There are policy solutions to the dilemma we face. We have to talk with neighbors about it. We have to sell the people of Wisconsin and the people of America on these solutions. We have to effectively recriminalize bribery. We have to help people understand why they are so blasted frustrated with their government and why their approval of Congress has reached historic lows, and why they are fed up with the legislature, and why they feel the need to have these recall elections, and why such madness has broken out. There's a problem behind that problem, and it is a problem that we can fix. I need your help in that area, and you know, I passed around a sheet of like 6 or 7 things you can do to help. But one thing's not on there that should be, and that's where I want to close before I throw it open for questions. The most important thing that people can do, by far, you know, you can write letters to the editor. I think that's on our list. You can contact legislators. That's on our list. You can do all kinds of stuff. You can organize town hall meetings or public forums. But the most important thing that people can do is what Cesar Chavez told a college student to do when that student approached him and said, "What's your secret?" I mean, here's this legendary farm worker organizer who had been able to excite masses of farm workers and bring tens of thousands of people into the streets to fight for their rights. And this college student came up to Chavez and said, "What's your secret? How do you organize? How do you do that?" And he said, "You talk to one person." And the kid said, No. I mean, how do you organize?" And he said, "You talk to one person." and then another, and then another. And that's what we need to do. And we can talk to one person and then another in ways that those people who rose up against Byron Kilbourne and Coles Bashford couldn't. They were making $1 a day. They had no television. They didn't even have radio at that time. They certainly didn't have the internet. They had no Facebook. They had no Twitter. They had no YouTube. We have so much more going for us now than they did then. We have so much more money. We have so much more education. Few of them had high school diplomas. Most of them were illiterate. We have got so much more going for us. We have so many more means of communication. So when you talk to one person, you can do it by tweeting. You can do it by networking on Facebook. You can do it over the picket fence across your backyard. But that is what we need to do. And we need to educate people about our own history. We need to educate people about the crisis that we face. We need to educate people about the fact that all is not lost and there are solutions to these problems, things that can be done that will make things right. Just as things seemed so hopeless more than a century ago, people made it right then, and they had a lot less going for them then than we do now. We can make things right today, but it's gonna take us rising up and making that happen, and that's what I call on all of you to join us in helping stir that pot here in Wisconsin. And let's hope there are people in every corner of this country who will do the same, because our democracy depends on it. Thank you. The question is, the Democracy Campaign flagged some illegal donations from a railroad executive by the name of William Gardner, and he's actually been convicted. He's been found guilty of a crime, but why isn't it a crime for the governor to accept those donations? It's wrong for the governor to accept those donations, but all of the donations appeared to be legal donations, because what Gardner was doing was laundering money. He was getting other people to make lawful donations within the limits of the law, and he was then using company funds to reimburse them for those donations. So he was effectively having his railroad company pay for all this money to flow into Scott Walker's campaign, but the donations were coming to the governor from individuals. And they were making donations within the legal limits, and all of it appeared to be kosher. What we were able to do is find that, first of all, Gardner himself had made donations in excess of the legal limit, and we filed complaints about that, and further investigation unearthed this money laundering scheme where people were actually being paid by Gardner or by his company for making these campaign contributions. That's a violation of the law. Now, it was wrong for Walker to accept that money. The prosecutors didn't see that he should be prosecuted because it appeared all the contributions that he was receiving were legal ones. Now, there is a growing investigation. In fact, a top Walker staffer's house was raided by the FBI just days ago. That appears to be possibly related to the Gardner matter and the money laundering. It also appears to be related to allegations that county employees who worked for Governor Walker when he was Milwaukee County executive may have illegally campaigned on county time with county resources, taxpayer money, using public offices to help the governor get elected. There is some evidence that both of those things are involved in the federal John Doe investigation that recently led to a top Walker staffer's house being raided. So this is not all over yet, but that's the answer to why Gardner was initially prosecuted and it didn't reach Walker at that time.
The top 10 colleges.
What are the top spending interest groups in Wisconsin elections. One of the things that is a myth that people need to come to terms with is, first and foremost, the idea that Republicans get their money from business and Democrats get all their money from labor. Actually, our analysis, and we've done a couple of different reports on this now, business interests give $12 to Wisconsin politicians for every dollar that labor unions give. But they not only give overwhelmingly more to Republicans than labor unions do, because labor unions give next to nothing to Republicans, but they also, depending on the year, they've given anywhere from 4 times to 6 times more than labor unions to Democrats. So business interests give substantially more money to both sides than labor unions do. Both parties rely primarily on business interests. So when you look at the top givers, yeah, you'll see a political action committee like Wisconsin Education Association Council, the state teachers union, will be in the top 10. But if you lump WEAC together with all the other labor unions, and then you lump all the business interests together, the business interests are giving $12 for every dollar that the labor unions give, and that counts WEAC, which is the big giver on the union side. So the big interests are construction interests, road builders, oil and gas interests, manufacturing, the tourism industry, the tavern and liquor industry, the alcohol industry in general are all huge givers. But when you combine all those business interests, that's where you come to the conclusion that we reached. $12 to politicians in Wisconsin for every dollar that comes from labor unions. Now that's, I think, part of the reason why in these recall elections, We Are Wisconsin relied so heavily on national money. Because the state-based money wasn't there. They couldn't raise $10 million relying on state or local labor unions. So they went to 3 national unions and they relied almost exclusively on outside money to raise that kind of cash. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah. To summarize the question briefly, the comment was made that what used to be relatively inexpensive assembly campaigns sometimes get really expensive, and the spending goes into 6 figures, and it feels icky to see where the money's coming from, and couldn't there be some limit placed on where that money comes from? Couldn't you have a requirement that the money actually be raised from people who can vote for the candidate? What a novel approach that would be. And then further, what about the claim that politicians make that, well, I don't have any control over what the outside groups do, and so don't look at me? Let me kind of take those in order. First of all, we are very, very far away from the ideal that you express. If you look at all state legislative candidates in Wisconsin, on average, all of them, all the Assembly and Senate candidates across our state, on average, they get 3/4 of their money from people who can't vote for them. Some legislative candidates actually get all of their money from people who can't vote for them. None of their money comes from people within their district. We've actually seen candidates who are 100% outside money, but on average it's 75%. And to me, that is also central to the crisis facing our democracy. Elections are supposed to be about voters deciding their political fate, deciding what kind of representation they want, deciding what they want someone to go and do in Madison or in Washington. And how can you get that kind of representation when those elected representatives have cash constituents who can't vote for them and who don't live in the district? That is a huge problem, and it's grown steadily worse in Wisconsin, to the point where on average 3/4 of the money is coming from out of district. It's people who cannot vote for these legislators. And of course, we could have reform that would change that. And we built a really strong component into ending welfare aimed at getting at the very problem you talk about. Because the public matching grants would only go for small donations from people who can actually vote for you. So if you went out and got a $50 donation from somebody who could vote in the election, you'd get a 4-to-1 public match. That $50 contribution would become a $250 contribution because it came from somebody inside your district who made that small donation. Up to a $100 contribution would get a 3-to-1 match. Bigger contributions wouldn't be matched. Contributions from outside your district would not be matched. That would be a powerful incentive for politicians to start to rely on people within their own communities to pay for their campaigns. That could be passed tomorrow. All that's absent is the political will. But those kinds of reforms are possible and are doable. We don't have to have politicians who are so incredibly beholden to outside interests, to a tiny segment of society. You know, we've also done studies, zip code analyses of campaign contributions. And almost all of the political money, over 90% of the money, comes from 10 zip codes. 10 Wisconsin zip codes supply over 90% of the political money. And then, of course, there's the out-of-state money. That could be addressed. We could have public policies like the one that we've suggested. And you could come up with different ideas. I'm not saying that that's the only idea that has merit, but it's something that the legislature could do tomorrow. And then when it's a cop-out for them to say we can't do anything about the outside groups, because they could go in and pass disclosure legislation tomorrow. They could go in there and pass shareholder rights and corporate accountability, shareholder consent legislation tomorrow. They could do a lot to make those groups accountable and visible and let the public see who's really buying the elections. And that has been blocked on a bipartisan basis. I have to criticize both parties here because the current legislature is controlled by the Republicans and the governor is a Republican, and they refuse to act on disclosure legislation. They refuse to act on policies that would encourage in-district giving. They have taken no action. They've blocked reforms. In fact, they repealed the Impartial Justice Act for Supreme Court. They did away with the dollar checkoff and the public financing fund, and they used it instead. They used the money instead for implementation of the law requiring a photo ID to cast a ballot, which is repugnant. And what an act of disrespect that was. People checked a box designating some of their taxes for public financing, and against their wishes, their money is now used to implement the photo ID law. That was a profound act of disrespect toward those taxpayers, hundreds of thousands of taxpayers. Those actions could be taken, but the last session of the legislature, the Democrats controlled both houses, and it was a Democratic governor, and there was disclosure legislation passed by the Senate. We had a majority of the members of both houses on record in favor of the bill, and the Assembly adjourned without taking it up and voting on it. Doyle said he would sign it. The Senate passed it. The session ended without action. So the Democrats killed disclosure as well. And so whether you're talking to a Democrat or to a Republican, and they give you that cop-out that we can't do anything about these outside groups, that's hogwash. It is a cop-out. They could pass shareholder consent. They could pass disclosure. They could pass public financing. They could make policies that would encourage people who can actually vote for them to be the primary sources of their campaign money, and they have repeatedly failed to act. They've repeatedly refused to act. And so we have a bipartisan problem on our hands. We do have a bipartisan scandal. Yes?
Given your 12-to-1 statistic, what are the implications of that for a recall campaign?
The question is, given the fact that you have most political money to candidates coming from business interests as opposed to labor, what implications does that have for a recall election involving the governor? the first thing that I would say is that I think if you're looking at labor money, it's almost assuredly going to come from outside of Wisconsin. Wisconsin labor money has never been as great as a lot of people thought it was. It's never been a primary source of political support for Democrats. It's a significant source, and labor unions give almost exclusively to Democrats. So cutting labor union capacity to give money only hurts the Democrats because they've almost exclusively gotten all the political money. But it's never been their primary source of support. They get 4 or 5 or 6 times more from business interests than they get from labor, and that's been true for years. So, you know, it would be outside labor money that would have to flow in. But, you know, I think what we saw in these Senate recall elections was mostly outside money on both sides. Most of the money came from outside our borders. I think that would certainly be the case in a recall involving the governor. But we also saw rough equality between the sides. We saw Democratic interests able to muster roughly the same amount of money as Republicans were able to come up with. So I don't think that money will be a deterrent. It's just that where the money is coming from is not good news for people in Wisconsin who would like elected representatives who actually care about Wisconsin voters in both parties. But I don't think money will be a deterrent factor. And I think there's an awful lot of stirred up people out there. I think a recall election petition drive is almost certain, and I think a successful petition drive is very, very likely. Now, whether once that election is triggered, whether that means Scott Walker can be beaten, that's another question. I'm not saying that he will actually be defeated, but I think it's highly likely, almost certain, that the petition drive will go forward at some point, and I think it's highly likely that the number of signatures will be obtained. Now, that is an astonishing fact. I can't tell you how many times over the years people have been ticked off about something some state official has done, and they call me and they'll say, "How do you recall that bozo?" And, you know, if it's a statewide official, I would say, well, it's about 540,000 signatures that you need to gather. And that would stop the conversation right there. Well, what else can we do? Can't they impeach him? And it was an absolute conversation stopper because it is such a daunting task. But as those Senate recall elections showed, there are enough stirred up people that astonishing numbers of signatures are gathered. You'd see 20, 30,000 signatures in a little state Senate district, and none of them were in Dane County, which is where the strongest base for an anti-Walker recall would be. So I think it's a very unusual circumstance, historic in nature. I don't think recall elections will become commonplace in our state. I don't think anybody has to worry about that. I think they'll remain very rare. It takes a really unusual set of circumstances for that Herculean effort to gather that many signatures to be successful. I think the conditions exist in this state. And I think 540,000 signatures is actually eminently doable. And I wouldn't have thought that possible a year ago or 2 years ago. I just didn't think recall was a practical option, hardly ever. 2 legislators had been recalled in the history of our state. It's not an easy thing to do. But I think you'll see it. Now, what happens in that election is anybody's guess. But if $44 million got spent on 9 Senate recall elections, you know, God forbid how much is going to be spent on a gubernatorial recall.
Another question?
I don't know how to fully summarize that question and do justice to it or that comment, but I think the gist of it is, aren't voters to blame for what happens, and haven't we lost the personal element of politics? And it's all mass media, and it's all paid for politics. It's not something that is more grassroots in nature. And my answer is yes. Anytime you have political dysfunction, anytime you have conditions arise where democracy gets unhealthy, it always is the responsibility of citizens. And we can never shirk that responsibility. It is always our fault if we let conditions get bad. Now, that's not to excuse the abominable behavior that we're seeing from so-called political leaders in our country. But ultimately, we have to make political leaders represent us and serve us, and we have been negligent. I don't think there's any question about that. And part of the reason I tell stories like that Wisconsin Dells story is to remind people that the people who had it tougher than us were able to make change. They were able to rise up against formidable economic forces, big money at that time, astonishing sums of money at that time, and they were able to successfully rise up against that. And that led to the creation of a state that we all inherited. You all knew that this was a special place, a beacon of clean and open and honest government. That's what we thought about Wisconsin. And we used to elect a guy named Bill Proxmire to the United States Senate repeatedly, and he never spent more than $300 on one of his statewide campaigns. He used to spend $150, $200. He never broke the $300 level, and he would win statewide office. Run for $300. Well, we had a $37 million race for governor in 2010. And we've all kind of sat back and just said, endure the ads. Here they come. And yes, we do need to change the political equation, and it does mean talking to one another about one of the things that we're all taught not to talk to people in polite company about. We do, and we always do. We always do. And so let me just leave one last thought that your comment triggers. I gave a speech at Fighting Bob Fest last Saturday, and it's a gathering of progressives. But I found myself quoting Milton Friedman at the end of my speech. These are strange times we live in. I found myself quoting Milton Friedman. Friedman said that change always requires a crisis, real or imagined. That real change only comes when there is a crisis. Whether that crisis is real or perceived doesn't matter. But when there's a crisis, that's when real change happens. And it's our job to make sure that good public policy alternatives are lying around at the time when the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. And I think right now, because of the state of citizenship, because of so much of the malignancy in our politics, a lot of things that need to happen are politically impossible. But we need to keep working to make sure that the right ideas are lying around when the politically impossible again becomes politically inevitable, because it will. And there was crisis, an economic depression in the late 1890s that, of course, triggered all of those great reforms. And who knows what the conditions will be when political inevitability visits us again, but we have got to be ready with the right kinds of ideas, and that means working as citizens right now to educate each other, to talk to one another, to be citizens, to teach citizenship in our schools, for crying out loud. We've gotten away from that. All of those things we have to fight for, because that's what ultimately is going to lead to real change. The question is, can we limit campaign expenditures? Actually, you can limit contributions. You can limit contributions to candidates. And that's constitutional. And it has been upheld repeatedly by the courts. What the courts have said is unconstitutional is saying that you can't use your own personal fortune to spend as much as you want if you're a candidate. And now they've said that you can't place any limit on corporate election spending or interest group spending. But the ban on corporate contributions to candidates remains constitutional, and it remains in effect. In 1905, the Wisconsin legislature banned corporate contributions and corporate election spending. The U.S. Supreme Court effectively overturned half of that law. They overturned the part of the law that prohibited corporate election spending to influence elections. But corporations still cannot give directly to a candidate. CEOs can give as individuals, top managers can give as individuals, but those contributions are limited. So there is an injustice here that's developed at the court's making, that candidates can be limited in the contributions they get, but interest groups can raise money from anywhere in as large amount as they want, and they can spend to their heart's content. You also could limit spending by candidates if the candidates agreed voluntarily to limit their spending in exchange for public financing. That's why in the 70s you saw all that public financing legislation. But the recent court rulings is why I'm saying to you, we have got to totally rethink that approach to public financing. Linking public financing to spending limits dooms public financing. For public financing to have a future, it has to be decoupled from the idea of limiting spending. And it has to be about giving candidates a clean option for running their campaigns, but they need to be able to raise money and compete with those interest groups. We can do some things to address those interest groups, and I've talked a lot about the measures that could be taken to hold them accountable, to make them get permission, all that kind of stuff, disclose. But I think it's a mistake to cleave to the old-fashioned approaches to public financing that contain spending limits, because that's what really has been rendered obsolete by these latest court rulings. I hope that makes sense and is clear. Yeah, the comment in question was, you know, today we might not know who our Byron Kilbourne is, who's making these large payments for political favors. And largely that is correct. Now I said that, you know, Wisconsin Club for Growth raised millions, and we were able to scour IRS records to find 2 donations. One from Trevor Reese Jones, who was a Byron Kilbourne, dumped $250,000 into this effort, and he's from Texas. And then Citadel, a corporation, a securities firm, doesn't operate in Wisconsin, put in $150,000 in a Kilbourne-esque fashion. You can find some of the donations if you look hard enough, but many of them many of the donors can and do remain anonymous. The donations are secret. And so we don't know who's actually doing the paying. In the old days, before bribery was illegal, they were openly exchanging bags of cash in our state capitol building. Byron Kilbourne could walk into the building, he could visit those members of the Assembly and Senate, and he could make the payment in exchange for their support. The game is shrouded in greater secrecy now. It's very stealthy, very hard to track down. But we were able to find that, you know, the Koch brothers, David and Charles Koch of Koch Industries, are a great example. They made a donation of $47,000 that was disclosed. But we found, through IRS records, over $1 million more that they funneled to a front group that then spent the money on advertising in Wisconsin. So they contributed well over $1 million to the effort to elect Scott Walker governor. Only $47,000 showed up on public records. The rest, it took quite an effort to locate that money and identify it. Sometimes you can, often you can't.
Well, let's thank Mike McCabe for giving us this excellent presentation.